So today is the 10th of Iyar. Just a couple of days, I think it's Sunday, the 14th of Iyar, is a day known as Pesach Sheni, second Pesach, second Passover. Now, what is Pesach Sheni all about? Well, it's the second Pesach. It's actually an opportunity for those who are unable to perform Pesach properly first time around, for a number of reasons, to do it. A central observance of Pesach is what's called the Pesach Sacrifice, Korban Pesach. And that had to be performed on a Friday, on the 14th of Nisan, the day before Pesach, eaten on the night of the Seder. It's actually a very central part of the Seder, but obviously it's absent nowadays because we're not doing Pesach. If somebody was away from Jerusalem or impure, ill, unable to perform Pesach 1, comes along a second opportunity, a second Pesach, second Passover, on Sunday when that Pesach sacrifice can be brought. So on Pesach Rishon, the first Pesach, we're really busy with all of the other mitzvahs of Pesach, and we don't talk much about the Pesach sacrifice. But Pesach Sheni, there isn't a formal Seder, so we can prepare by talking about this Pesach sacrifice. And the question that I want to put tonight is, can we offer a Korban Pesach today? Is it possible to offer the sacrifice today? Now, you may be looking at me and saying, well, how is that possible? After all, don't you need to have a Beit HaMikdash? Don't you need to have a holy temple? Well, interestingly, this question arose in a very serious way in 1967. Until then, well, it wasn't really possible because there wasn't Jewish control of Temple Mount, and there was no way that a Pesach sacrifice could be brought. But came Pesach of 1968, because of course the Six-Day War took place just before Shavuot, and at the very end of the month of Iyar, and we'll have Yom Yerushalayim to mark that in a couple of weeks' time. So the following Pesach, when, as was announced at the end of the Six-Day War, Har Habayit b'Yadeinu, the Temple Mount in our hands, the question arose: should we actually offer a Pesach sacrifice? But wait a second. As I said, there is no temple. Isn't the presence of a holy temple an absolute necessity to be able to offer sacrifices? Surprise, surprise. I'd like you to read with me the words of Maimonides. He says, and this is in the laws of Beit HaBechira, the laws of the Holy Temple, and he discusses the fact that the sanctity of the Beit HaMikdash never left Temple Mount. That despite the fact that the structure was destroyed, not once but twice, the sanctity never left that spot. And therefore, he rules that one may offer sacrifices on a temple site without the Beit HaMikdash and everything else. I mean, the second part of the first paragraph is kind of not very practical. It would be if you offered the Pesach sacrifice and then, a sacrifice, and then the courtyard, was destroyed. It's in ruin. It's a day after. And what do you do then? So the sanctity of Jerusalem, of the Holy Temple, and so forth, are still standing, even though there isn't a Beit HaMikdash. In fact, if you read certain Talmudic accounts, it would appear that when they started building the second temple, the second temple was built at the end of the Persian rule, and it was actually around the time of Achashverosh that this was stopped. And why was it stopped? He was very insecure about the Jews getting Jerusalem back, and he didn't want them to have a temple. And so they stopped building, and Temple Mount was actually a building site at the beginning of the Second Temple era, or just prior to the Second Temple, for a while. And they built, and during that period, they put up partitions without there being a structure, and they offered sacrifices. So clearly, it is possible. You don't actually have to have a physical structure of a Beit HaMikdash, and therefore the fact that the temple hasn't been built, that in itself would not be an objection. But there are some challenges. Some are halachic, others are of a more practical nature, to actually come to offer a Pesach sacrifice, be it in Pesach Rishon or the Sunday on Pesach Sheni. The immediate objection is the fact that we are impure, we are tamei, and in order to not just ascend Temple Mount, but definitely to offer service in the Beit HaMikdash, you have to be in a state of personal purity. How do you become personally pure? Well, there's only one way of doing it. It's not really something which is open to us today, and that is the ashes of the Red Heifer. Now, why can't you do that today? Because every one of the Red Heifers that were offered had some of the ashes of the original one that Moshe made, and there were 9 to date, the original one, plus 8 subsequent ones. And in the 8 subsequent Red Heifers that were offered, when they reduced the sacrifice to ashes, which they were going to use to sprinkle on people, they mixed some of the original ashes with it. So we can't really recreate. We are therefore stuck in a state of impurity, which we are not able to get out of. So how can we offer sacrifices? Once again, surprise. If impurity is something that affects the majority of Klal Yisrael, the majority of the people are impure, then the laws of impurity are set aside. So in an ideal situation, we have most people being pure, and some people being impure, because it's always going to be unavoidable, because impurity is brought about by ritual, impurity is brought about by contact with somebody who's passed on, and death is as unavoidable as taxes are, and therefore you're going to find people attending funerals, having to attend to the burial of the dead, having been present when somebody died, and therefore it's impossible to avoid people becoming impure. But a 7-day process involving the sprinkling of the red ashes, you can get out. Under normal circumstances, the majority of the community is pure, and the smaller number is impure. In fact, that's how Pesach Sheni was born. Most of the Jews in the desert actually were in a state of ritual purity. There were a couple of people. It's suggested that those were the people who were the bearers of the coffin of Joseph and his brothers that were being carried with them. So they were busy with that mitzvah, and they felt very aggrieved that they would not be able to offer Pesach sacrifice, and they were told that they would have a second chance, or somebody else could take over the duty, and they could then do Pesach Sheni. So majority of the Jews are pure, a minority are impure, and those are the people who are excluded and have to be, shifted to the second Pesach a month later. But if there should be a situation where the great majority of the Jewish nation is impure, is tamei, then those laws of impurity are set aside, and one can offer the sacrifice in a state of impurity. So we've solved the problem of not having a temple. That's not necessary. We've solved the problem of not needing to be in a state of purity to offer the Korban Pesach. But here comes a rather complicated challenge. We have to have Kohanim. I will not bore you with the story of the man who approached the rabbi and begged to be made into a Kohen, and after a suitable donation, the rabbi agreed, but he had one question: so why do you want to be Kohen? And the answer was, my father was, my grandfather was, my great-grandfather was, why shouldn't I be? So that's an old joke, but the reality is that we don't really know who is a Kohen today. We work on what's called chazakah, or assumption. If a man comes into shul and says, my father was a Kohen, my grandfather was a Kohen, my grandfather was good. We take people, and we believe this claim. And what do? Well, there's not that many privileges. Even the Kohanim, I don't know if I'm quickly looking at that attendance list tonight, even though Kohanim are extremely proud of the Yichus as Kohanim, there isn't really so much to it except that you get your first Aliyah, you can have the privilege of showing off your socks on Yom Tov when you stand on the river facing the community, and hope that you remembered that you had to have a fairly new pair of socks that does not embarrass you when you take off your shoes, in duchening. But there's not much real consideration in being a Kohen today. If you want to serve in the Holy Temple, you have to be a guaranteed Kohen, which means not just that we assume you are because your father was and your grandfather was, but you actually are able to substantiate the character of Kohen by having a family tree that links you back all the way to the original Kohen that was Aaron Kohen. Few people have that now, or at least that you can trace back to somebody who was a known Kohen, established without any doubt. That is very difficult to establish now. That in fact, more often than not, when people look into the claims, sometimes somebody thought he was a Kohen. Why is he a Kohen? Because in Cheder, the teachers are Kohen, Levi Yisrael, he said, no, I'm a Kohen. It sounded good. The fact that you have a surname Cohen is no proof either. And where does this come out? This comes out when a Cohen suddenly wants to marry a woman who was previously married, a divorcee, or somebody who's converted to Judaism. Of course, a Cohen may not do that. That's actually in this week's Parsha, Parshat Emor. So the Kohen now starts making an investigation, approaching the Beth Din, and we start looking carefully at previous generations. So it takes us to go to the cemetery of a grandfather who may be buried in London, and you look at the tombstone, it's actually not true. I mean, we had a Levi in our community for many years, and then one day his brother approached me, asked me to perform a marriage service. It happened to be that the shul where the brother went didn't have a rabbi, so he brought me his documents, and I said, "You left out the word Levi." He said, "No, I'm not a Levi." I said, "But your brother is, is a same father or half brothers?" "No, definitely same surname, same father." And that's when the investigation, revealed that he wasn't a Levi. Same with the Kohanim. But for normal purposes, we're happy to go by assumption. When Ezra brought the Jews back from Babylon, and they resumed temple service in that area I was referring to earlier, second Beit HaMikdash, Ezra asked the Kohanim to bring family trees to substantiate their claim that they're Kohanim, and only those who actually were able to establish that they were genuine Kohanim. But that was easy because it was 2 generations only. I mean, the entire Babylon exile lasted not more than 70 years, so it was not that difficult to bring proof your grandfather was a Kohen. But today, how would we have temple service without Kohanim? Enter technology. And of course, you may have heard of this, there is a Kohen gene. Now, very quick genetics lesson. There are different forms of DNA, but you can actually look for something called the Y DNA, and the Y DNA sits on the Y chromosome, which is something only men have. So if you find a particular gene that sits on the Y DNA, it was inherited from father who inherited from father. Normal DNA, which they call autosomal, can be inherited by mother or father because the cells split and you get half of the genetic material from father, half from mother, and so most of your DNA would be of this type. But some of your genetic markers actually sit on the Y chromosome, and therefore they can be established to clearly go back. Now, there is a Kohen Y DNA, and that links, research has been done, and it's been found that that gene is prevalent among many Kohanim. Extensive research was made, And therefore, that Kohen gene seems to establish that somebody is actually a Kohen that can trace his ancestry to that common ancestor that all Kohanim should have, patriarchal ancestor, which is Aaron Kohen. Of course, that doesn't prove you're Jewish, because somewhere along the line there, in the pink could have been somebody who is not Jewish that could have broken the chain. But you give me a Kohen, even if you're not Jewish Kohen genetically. So, but if it's established and accepted that you're Jewish, then that Y DNA could actually establish incidentally. And I'm digressing here, but just like there's Y DNA, there's also something called mitochondrial DNA, and that's something which you only inherit from your mother. And there is now genetic Jewish genes, and very recently they've started accepting that as additional proof of Jewishness when people are unable to show they haven't got papers, particularly immigrants from the former Soviet Union, and there's no evidence that they actually Jewish, because there was no documents, and so many of them come to Israel, and so they've started accepting a Jewish genetic test as supporting evidence, and that's the extent to which DNA testing is now being accepted halachically. So one could possibly posit that Y DNA Kohen gene would establish that a person is an actual Kohen stemming from Aaron, rather than just an assumed Kohen, in the same way as Jewishness could come from the mitochondrial DNA that we all have if we are genetically or Jewish by birth. So that would be a fascinating way of establishing Jewishness. So we've set aside another challenge, but there's another one. And that is that you need to offer the sacrifices on the altar. And the altar has to be in a very specific place. And these are the words of Rambam when he describes where the altar must be. He says it's got to be in a very precise location, which cannot be changed. And there's historical background to that altar. It's the place where the altar of Yitzchak, the Akedah, was built. And when King David went to buy that threshing floor from Arvana, he was looking for that place, and other things happened there as well. And it's a very important place. And Rambam says, this is taken from the second chapter of the Laws of the Temple, Rambam says, therefore, that it has to be constructed in a very precise location. How do we know where that is? And one can try and work it out. This is kind of a drawing, a blueprint of what the temple area looked like. This is the building of the Holy Temple. Here, steps leading up to it. Here's the Holy of Holies, on which you can see the production there of the Holy Ark. Here in the front, you have this is the western wall. Entrance came from the east. You entered into what's called Ezrat Nashim, or a woman's courtyard, and then from there you ascended some steps. You ended up in the Kohanim area where the altar was very precisely located. So one can try and work it out, but we really don't know exactly where. And it's complex. One of the reasons why people avoid going onto Temple Mount, besides the political considerations, is because this area here is off limits to anybody but a Kohen. This area here, definitely may not step, even if you're a Kohen, into the Holy of Holies. There are parts here where you have to be pure, but not pure as in Red Heifer pure, but just mikveh pure, which we can all achieve. But so it's complicated. And although there are people who've studied this and pored over this map in great detail, it is not possible to actually establish it absolutely. Enter technology. Now, how is technology going to help us to establish where the altar used to be and to rebuild an altar in that identical spot to be able to do a Pesach sacrifice? Well, interesting technological approach. And let me explain that the Temple Mount, the entire Beit HaMikdash, was built on archways. And that was to avoid accidental contamination by impurity. Let me explain. We know that if there is a dead body that is buried in the ground and you walk over that, then you become impure yourself. That's why when we leave the cemetery, we ritually wash our hands, because we're kind of stepping in very close proximity or possibly over a grave and so forth. So an impurity that is underground kind of seeps up and then bursts out and contaminates anything above it. So that's a bit of a problem because people are coming into the temple and they don't really want to be, contaminated by the possibility of a dead body that is beneath somewhere in the mountain. So this is how they built the Holy Temple. And they built it by a system of archways. Now, what happens is, say an impurity was found in the ground here, it will seep up, but when it hits that wall, it ends. So by building kind of a double arches, if an impurity was anywhere within the mountain and forgotten about, unknown about, it would not be able to burst out to the top. And so it's described in ancient sources how the temple was built in its entirety over with these archways, except for the spot of the Mizbeach, of the altar, that remained as is. They did not do the archway system beneath it. One can today, and archaeology uses that system, one can today with infrared, whatever it's called, infrared light, one can establish what the ground below is like, whether that's archways or not. So that technology has been used to try and pinpoint where the altar is built. So now we know where to build our altar. What do we still have a problem with? We have a problem with the fact that the Kohanim must be dressed in a very specific way. That they're garments of the Kohanim that had to be donned while service was taking place. And a Kohen that was not dressed in the correct garments of the Kohuna, his service was invalid. Now, they're described, so it's not difficult to reproduce, but one material that has to be used in the garments of the Kohanim is techelet. That color that we also have in our tzitzit, that sprinkle blue, that royal blue, had to be used in the big day kahuna. We don't really have access to it. Well, at least we didn't until fairly recently. It was the work of many Rabbonim who came together over the years and did research and found where that could be, how the dye could be created. It's become more and more common to see people in shul wearing a talit with the tzitzit strings and the blue. So although it hasn't reached universal acceptance, but more and more people are recognizing that this blue is actually the blue of the techelet, and so it's possible to reproduce and to create garments of Kohanim. So we can now find genuine Kohanim through DNA. We can locate the exact spot of the temple, of the altar at least, via infrared lights. We can now create garments of the Kohanim because we have now got the technology to build the, to at least create the techelet. So what's stopping us? What's stopping us? Well, the realities, the geopolitical realities of the fact that although Har Bayit was biyadenu, and that was maybe true in 1968, but current events show that although politically it falls within the boundaries of Israel, control is not ours, and it would not be wise to try and build an altar. This is a suggested placement of the altar. Anybody think this is going to go down well? To try and build that altar right in front of that dome. There's a view that the correct place for the altar is actually inside the dome, under the dome, where there's a stone that some suggest would be the Even Shtia, the foundation stone. Well, clearly the location of where that altar would have to be built is fraught with tensions and what would not be easy. There is a group every single year. When I searched this story online, I found the story for this year, April 14, 2022. That was the day of Erev Pesach, when somebody was arrested. They made plans to sacrifice a lamb. So those are people actually not just discussing it in a shiur, but actually plan to do this. And they are arrested every single year, because I found a story for 2021 and 2020 and going back for many years. There's a group of people who do this, and I don't know if they really think they're going to manage, or if they're doing it for coverage and for publicity, for the hope that people are going to become more aware of it. I've heard of people who actually set aside, with great faith, a sheep. You're supposed to prepare the sheep several days ahead, some people do this with the hope that Mashiach will come and they'll have the Korban Pesach ready, whereas the rest of us will be scrambling to find sheep on time. But I want to share with you this website that I came across. I'm sorry, but it's in Hebrew only, but I will translate. Metzapim liyeshua means we expect the redemption. We are expecting the redemption. And this is subscription to a Korban Pesach. It's a subscription to a Korban Pesach. And because the Korban Pesach, you couldn't just simply arrive on the day, but you actually had to subscribe together as a group with a number of people to be able to be part of this. I'm going to rush now because we have load shedding at 8, and I might just go back and be found in the dark in a moment. And so this group of people, I don't know if it's really in the hope or being cynical and they're just trying to make some money, whatever it is. I'd heard about this and actually found this online. For 18 shekel, you can get the size of an olive, and if you want to go a bit more, then you can get a larger portion. Here you can get for 80 shekel Pesach matzah and maror, already your korach sandwich already. So this is a group at least who are doing something proactive, but not storming Temple Mount, but encouraging people to prepare for the redemption, and that we can do, despite all the geopolitical issues as well as the halachic issues, and that is to prepare for the Korban Pesach, prepare for the coming of Mashiach in the best way possible. Thank you for joining me.